there was such a violence both in the enactment of the institution of slavery, the disciplining of enslaved people, but also there was a level of sexual violence and therefore the emotional resonances of trauma which have led to an inability to remember.
Resistance was very important to the experience of the slaves, the experience of the slavery. It's because it's the resistance of slaves that really allows us to say something about the slaves themselves. It's the time when they step out of the darkness of history.
In the mid-1990s, I was part of a group of writers and artists and feminist scholars writing about slavery, creating art about slavery, teaching about slavery, and initiatives that were much broader than us, that produced curriculum materials for schools.
The resilience and the resistance that's embedded in the work do reflect on what ordinary people are doing and the way forward.
The Cape rebellions don't kind of enter that big league, like the most famous one is the Haitian Revolution and, the Baptist War in Jamaica and some big uprisings in the United States. But what you do have is a more or less thread that goes through the whole history of slavery of all kinds of personal resistance.
Forms of resistance were as subtle and oblique as stealing time, working more slowly, running away, escape, flight, creating maroon communities at Hung Clip.
And one of the big questions is, why were there so few coordinated, politically motivated slave uprisings in the Cape? Firstly, the slave society at the Cape was a very mixed group of people. It was the most ethnically diverse slave society on earth.
I think sometimes we tend to think of resistance only in terms of uprisings, rebellions, and there were some of those. But on the whole, the way in which slaves here resisted was much more individual. And one of the big means of resisting was running away.
And this is where slavery at the Cape is different to slavery in the New World and slavery elsewhere, is that slavery took place in the context of indigenous people who were themselves unfree and oppressed labour. The Khoisan of the Cape were constantly being forced into labour relations against their will.
It was remarkable how frequently crops caught fire just before the harvest. In fact, on several occasions there was quite a lot of damage was done by fire in Cape Town, which was caused by deliberate arson by slaves.
We don't have that many maroon societies in South Africa, but we do have a lot of mixed race droster or oorlam or buster societies which emerge on the South African frontier. And these are a hybrid. They're a mixture of runaway slaves and indigenous societies with the odd European settler. Eventually they established independent oorlam groups along the Orange River and indeed over the Orange River into what is now southern Namibia or into the Free State.
In Cape Town itself, Cape Town is an unusual city because it's built around a mountain, a very huge mountain, the whole chain of Table Mountain. So slaves from the city would run away and many of them would live on the mountain, sometimes for years.
And these runaway slaves are very often supported by a network of domestic slaves in the town who would leave food or provisions for these runaways.
Running away was a big problem for slave owners, and particularly on the farms in the outlying districts in the remoter parts of the colony, because it was so easy. There's this landscape beyond which is not controlled by the company or by the farmers, and people can run away into it.
Today, if you venture along that coastline, you'll see it's very broken and rugged. And this is probably where these slaves lived, and they lived off marine resources, shellfish, crayfish, fish, bulb roots from fynbos plants. And what we know about these slaves is that they spent a lot of time actually fighting amongst each other. We shouldn't idealize or glamorize the life of runaway slaves. It was very often nasty, brutish, and short.
We know that there were people born there, so there were children born in Huncliffe. So here we have children of runaways born in Huncliffe, so they were in the Cape Colony. So legally they were slaves, and if they were caught, the company enslaved them. But in fact, they'd never known a world of slavery.
And eventually this community sort of dissolved. It couldn't sustain itself because of the high levels of internal violence, and also because they were constantly being hunted and pursued by commandos. The Merman Mutiny of 1766 reminds everybody that the slaves that came to the Cape were brought from elsewhere. Indigenous people weren't enslaved at the Cape, although sometimes they were treated worse than slaves. But the slaves were brought to the Cape by sailing vessels brought from East Africa, from Madagascar, or from the East Indies. And the Merman was a slaving vessel that came from Madagascar. At the Cape we also had the equivalent of the Middle Passage, the horrific period of transportation where slaves who had been sold into slavery were transported over the ocean.
And when they came fairly close, there was an uprising among the recently captured slaves on the ship, and they forced the crew of the ship to sail back to Madagascar. But of course these slaves had never left land before, so they have no idea about direction and how does the ship work, and secretly the crew sailed towards the Cape. So when they came close to the south coast of the Cape, close to Cape of Galas, the crew started to write letters and put them in bottles and throw them overboard, and these then washed ashore, and there was then this kind of standoff between the slaves on the ship with their hostages and the people on shore, and eventually the slaves were overpowered.
Perhaps the interesting thing in the conclusion of this story is that one of the main leaders of the slave rebellion was brought to trial in the Cape to explain to the authorities exactly what had happened. And they were so impressed by his testimony that they didn't execute him. He eventually ended his days on Robben Island as a prisoner.
So Louis van Mauritius, along with his fellow leader, a man called Abraham van der Kaap. So already it's interesting that Louis comes from Mauritius, which is not a common source for slaves. The timing of this incident is so important because it happens in what historians call the era of revolutions.
It took place after the slave trade had been abolished in 1807. I stress the slave trade was abolished in 1807, not slavery itself. Because by 1807 you had a British government at the Cape, and the British government was dedicated to the eventual abolition of slavery.
So this guy Louis got together with some of the other slaves in Cape Town, and they decided that they were going to go into the countryside, they were going to gather up all the slaves from the farms, and then they were going to march back onto Cape Town and demand their freedom. They were going to, as they put it, fly the red flag of freedom.
Hundreds of slaves rose up and marched towards the Cape with the idea of perhaps taking over the castle and declaring their freedom and independence.
Louis was absolutely obsessed about having the right clothes. It had to be white Chinese linen trousers. It had to be a blue jacket with red epaulets. They had to be red. He had to have 2 swords, not 1, 2. He had to have a hat, and he had to have feathers on the hat, and the feathers had to be proudly displayed. There's a print which was going the rounds of Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian slave revolt. Louis was modelling himself completely on Toussaint, and was part, therefore, of that huge wave of crying for liberty which was taking place throughout the Atlantic world at this time.
The reason why the Galant uprising is so well known is once again because of the context. In the 1810s, Britain starts to adopt all kinds of laws and enforce them at the Cape, which were to protect slaves more. It became clear in many people's eyes that it's just a matter of time before we will come to final abolition of slavery, which happens in 1834. And so you have things like a slave protector being appointed at the Cape, and the slaves could have the right to go, if they were maltreated by the owners, they could go and complain to the slave protector or his representatives in some towns.
And so slaves were aware of this. They thought, the whole system is beginning to shift in our favor. And they became basically impatient. They wanted not just reform and amelioration, they wanted the abolition of slavery.
It's in this context of talk about the likely ending of slavery that you have this uprising happening in a very remote area.
And so the farmers of this district in the Koue Bokkeveld were determined perhaps not to institute any reforms, to ignore the whole drift towards abolition, and to assert their authority and their will over their slaves.
This is a true revolution, it's a true uprising. There's no doubt whatever that, of course, word of this quickly got around amongst the other slaves, and from then on we see constant complaints made by slaves about their maltreatment, much more than they'd done before, and demands for freedom.
Slave rebellions at the Cape did not lead to liberation, but they did lead to the assertion of individual identity and individual agency. In a sense, every single slave engaged in an act of resistance and rebellion was reasserting their humanity. We can't judge history in this sense by winners and losers or victors and defeated. In a slave society, the real heroes are the ones who resist even though they fail.
But there are other things I think we also need to recognize about slavery and ways in which slaves dealt with the situation they'd found themselves in. And that is the integrity that they maintained in cultural life. And Islam is the obvious example of this. The very fact that Islam spread in the Cape, which saw itself as being an absolutely Christian Dutch Reform colony.
Muslim enslaved people and indigenous people were living side by side and learning from one another and constituting new cultures together. Sufi Islam draws very much on the practices of the body, and Ratip is an example where the crossings over as well with Khoi and San practices of trance dancing.
When I think about what Louis van Mauritius and Galant van der Kaap, what they did, and it might be viewed as being very violent, we must also remember that they did not see a future. There was no light shining on what their tomorrow is going to be. So they took some form of action.
The longer impact of slavery is present in the complexity of the post-apartheid and apartheid periods. The ways in which, for instance, it has been possible for us to carry a kind of contempt for the descendants of enslaved people into what has been an attempt to craft a new national culture. That tells me that there's something broken in our understanding of ourselves, that it is actually a dismissal and a marginalizing of precisely that form of survival and resistance. So if we focus only on one element of our history, we might forget the shards and the cracks that lie at the bottom